Now we will move to the first panel, where I hope to give an overview of the chair outcomes, but also discuss some of the key findings related to refugee education. Thank you. Colleagues in Lebanon, just want to make sure that you can hear me well. I'm going to try to speak as loudly as I can, so I'm sorry for those who are with us in the room if I'm too loud. You see someone's face. Okay. Thank you very much. Do we have it? Okay, so just to give you a bit of context, since we are celebrating Refugee Week, 123 million people in the world are refugees. 1 in every 65 people is a refugee. And these numbers have doubled in the past 20 years, only in the past. So let's hope there wouldn't be new wars, because the situation is already quite bad. And refugees, in general, in terms of their educational outcomes, they have one of the lowest outcomes. Since we are in a university site, only 1% of refugees ever make it to higher education. So the vast majority, so we're talking basically about 123 million who educational prospects are almost non-existing. Less than 30% of them make it to secondary schooling. So the vast majority at best get some literacy. And this is a very devastating situation. But today I'm just going to share some of the findings of my research, but for those who know me, I work a lot in research groups and teams, so my colleagues will be presenting more of these findings in detail around knowledge production, but also around impact of humanitarian responses on governance, etc., later in the day. So let's see how this will work. Working. I need to switch on it. Or we can select. Okay, thank you. Okay, so just to give you a bit of background about this bilateral chair, it's quite a unique program from FCDO to support research on education in crisis by basically, and I think it's a more and more an issue that we're becoming more and more aware of, which is the inequitable research collaborations between Global North and Global South research institutions. So the idea of this bilateral chair is how we can promote equitable research and knowledge production across Global South and Global North to avoid this kind of extractivist research that often happens. So this was a 3-year chair program that comes with a generous pot of funding that you could use for the chair to use in any area that they wish to support capacity strengthening and sharing between Global North and South institutions. So what we've achieved, and my project has been on unpacking the industry of refugee education. I started my work quite depressingly. It's more than 17 years. The first study that I've done on education of Palestinian refugees who've been displaced with the creation of Israel in 1948 in Nakba. So my research focused on Palestinians living in Lebanon and their education outcomes. And then comes the Syrian refugee crisis, and then we have a huge influx of refugees in Lebanon. So I've been researching since the first day one of the refugee crisis, how has Lebanon, but also how has the humanitarian sector provided education to Syrian refugees? And in comparison, Syria has got lots of interest from researchers, but also around the world compared to, for instance, Sudan. We have a huge number of displaced people in Sudan, but we don't get the same attention in terms of researching the educational experiences. Now, the reasons for that is another thing. We can talk about many political racism and etc. But this is how it is. So my research program focused on one research component. I wanted to understand who is influencing the discourse on humanitarian policy and practice and research. There was a capacity bridging scheme. And here I want to emphasize it's not about just developing the research capacities of the Global South. It's about developing the research capacities of both countries because it goes both ways. Both of us have to learn a lot. And we wanted also to link research, policy, and practice together through creating a refugee education hub. So now moving to what we've achieved so far. So if we can move to the next slide. Thank you, Sheila. So through the fellowship scheme, we've been able to offer 42 fellowships and research bursaries and grants. And this has been great because it provided researchers, obviously early career researchers, with the opportunity to do research that they wish to do, but also to support researchers who have a full-time post, but they need research grants to do their research. We've done lots of workshops in summer schools, writing retreats, etc. And we created the Knowledge Collective, which is through our events, many of the early career scholars set up. And I have Melissa and Serene in Lebanon and Jafia who are leading and supporting this group, basically for early career researchers to come together and organize their own thing. So, and that's one way of sustainability. We've done lots of engagement with government and policy officials, podcasts, and we've set up an educational monitor which aims to, because since we started, and this chair is called Education in Crisis, the crisis in Lebanon kept evolving, unfortunately, and we just kept firefighting all the time. And then we decided to establish the monitor, which responds quickly to the evolving crisis and produce research and information. So, for instance, when the war and the Israeli attacks on Lebanon happened last year or a few months ago, we were able to assess the impact and produce data very quickly. Okay, in terms of also publications, these are some of the publications that have been produced by the researchers. And one of the things that I'm very proud of is our recent collaboration with Manhajiyat, where we published the work of teachers in Gaza going through the genocide. What does it mean to be a teacher? And if I ever believe education as a priority, even during genocide, like I'm more, it's not a luxury. And unfortunately, with the defunding and the funding cuts of aid, education is deprioritized because it's not seen as life-saving. But when you, we'll see in the next, later on in the panel, it is a life-saving process. Yes, thank you. Okay, so just a quick reflections on the theme. I think it's been really a privilege to have this chair because it really shows the importance of, British Academy has been fully supportive on academic freedom, on us doing our research agenda. They never monitor what we say. And I think that's, not many people have that privilege. Many academics are worried about what they can say and they can't say, what they can write and they can't write. Can they name things? We have been very fortunate with us being given full support, even when we had previous clashes with the Minister of Education in Lebanon who wanted to silence us on some research. There was full support. And I think it shows the importance of that kind of academic funding, the importance of global South-led research institutions because they can respond quickly to any issue. It shortens the cycles for response. And it helps amplify, usually as the scholars from the global South, we're invited as case study forward, but we're never seen as not producers of theory. And I think that's very important. Sometimes, unfortunately, you have to go through you have to get the credentials from the Global South for you to be able to accentuate your research. It's an unfortunate reality, but it still works this way. Is it, and then the question, can we actually do equitable partnership? And this has been a theme running across the chairs. What does it mean to have a bilateral chair? Are we equal in our collaboration? And I think there's a lot of work to be done. There's still this idea of, and usually it's the bureaucrats of the institutions that hinder equitable partnerships, right? Because of the way they see things. So it's usually the questions are, has the Global South capacities been given of the Global North? It's like what we have learned. So there are still issues to be addressed there. But also, how do we measure success? That's sometimes criteria by some of these grants or some of the institutions might see it differently. But I think the main criteria that matters is, will this collaboration continue? Will there be learning across both ways? So this is to conclude the chair. Now I'm going to move to more academic presentation style. So, and I will share about what we have done. So education of refugees is a relatively new field, 20 to 25 years. and particularly in the humanitarian setting. Okay, so we know that there has been research on education of refugees for ages. Most of it happened in the global north. Education became increasingly part of a humanitarian response. And it's a great shift, but it's not an easy shift. And now it is anchored in the global compact on refugees, but now unfortunately it's being deprioritized because of the funding cuts. And I think that's the biggest risk that we have. Okay. And the logic behind why should we provide education for the children? So because it's from a humanitarian context, refugees are often portrayed as broken, to be saved, right? And the discussion started usually as there's traumatized. And it's unsurprisingly, my colleague later will present, but when we look at what knowledge has been produced, mental health and psychology was number one, okay? Which is very interesting, particularly in the Arab world. It's like 90% of the studies were on children's psychology. While that's important, there are other issues that are also super important. But then this discussion shifted to, okay, well, let's actually provide formal accredited schooling because that will give a future for these children as well. But also we have seen a shift, for instance, from Afghanistan, where most of the education responses were community-led, whether private subsidized, or madrasas. Now we're moving to a different system. Now we're moving to a system that is managed by the humanitarian sector, and the humanitarian sector is telling us it's best to provide this education to the governments of the hosting countries. Now I will go through that case study of Lebanon, whether it is a good idea or not. But now, if you open any report, Save the Children or anything, it's taken for granted that the best education to be provided is through the host state, okay? And most of education used to happen in a way informal, not accredited. Now there's more formal accredited schooling. I used to believe this is a very good thing, but then we will see in Lebanon whether this actually works. But whatever happened, we can see that there's more centralization of response, and that centralization is happening with humanitarian agencies, and the vast majority of these humanitarian agencies are global north led. So in some ways, there have been a shift from community-led to center-led. Okay, we can move to the next slide. But there is, and this work, I've worked with my colleague Catherine Boone on unpacking the oxymoron or the contradiction between the logics of humanitarianism and education, which we rarely think about. And we rarely discuss. But humanitarianism is by nature short term. So most of the programs are short term. The funding is short term. It's about saving lives. But education is about future. It's transformational. It's long term. So how do you balance your way of working, which is short term, by planning for the next 15 years at least? Humanitarian logic claims to be neutral. I mean, that's another question. And apolitical education, by nature, is a very political exercise, particularly nation-state-led education. So, how do we control then what is being taught, which curriculum, what are the implications of this? The first one is biological. It's about saving lives. Literally. The other one is about people's future, their experiences, their identities, etc. And humanitarianism is inherently embedded in charity and saviorism. And I think that's a big issue because, okay, if we provide schooling, then what is the objective of this and what will it lead to in the future? The focus of a humanitarianism at the moment is widening access because 20 years ago, 30% of refugees had any form of primary school. And we talk about primary schooling, it's a very vague, rough notion, because actually when you look at how UNHCR counts these numbers, they actually count anyone who accessed any form of program, even food program, and had some form of instructions. So even the numbers, we have to take them with a carefully. Now UNHCR reports that these numbers have increased. I will show later. But the issue of education is we know that, we've seen 50 or 60 years ago, or even more, when we all called for access to education and the right to education, okay? Later, we realized it doesn't result in access, equality of access to the outcomes, right? We could all be educated equally, but your opportunities versus mine will differ from your class, color, etc. And that's what humanitarian education doesn't talk about yet, because They don't even mention the long-term purpose of education. So if we move a bit further, so these according to statistics from UNHCR, how we have improved in the past 20 years. So primary education, again, the numbers are much higher. But there's a very interesting report written by, I think, UNESCO and another organization that actually looks at how these numbers are made. And I think we need to question how these numbers are actually when we talk about primary, are these children, there's a World Bank report that says the vast 60% of children around the world are not able to meet the minimum standards of reading and writing. So we do have a bigger issue. Okay. And as the humanitarian education, I insist on calling it humanitarian education. Whenever I publish and the editors would correct it, no, it's not humanitarian education. It is a humanitarian education. And it has shifted from being community-led to these different actors. And what we're seeing is increasing actors like GPE, Education Can't Wait. But to be honest, if you go to the countries where education is being provided, I feel like we're building more and more layers that are global north-centric rather than actually giving agency to the communities. And I think that is one issue. I know globally we're talking about localization to undo some of this, but I think that's not going to solve it. So, okay. Now, humanitarianism says it's apolitical, but it's anything but apolitical. I'll just give you an example of an interview that I did with someone from UNICEF, I think 2 years into the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon. This person was visited by an EU delegation, and we all know that at that time how, we all know that right I think there's a mic in Lebanon that's being switched on. Okay, so and this person told me the EU delegation told me basically whatever it costs, provide education for these children because we want them to stay here. And we know if you have any kid, you and how schooling, once you have a child, you will tend to move less because you become tied into their school. So often the responses are dictated by global politics and by global politics. And we know that xenophobia is on the rise, both north and south. And that has affected what kind of provisions. But also when you provide refugee education in these contexts, the hosting countries also go, you have to keep them happy. And then the compromise ends up being between the funders, the humanitarian sector, and the host countries. And the minimum person that gets any hearing are refugees and refugee communities. Now, a response to that is localization. But just to give you very quickly, we're doing a study now on localization in Lebanon and Jordan. The terminology, when we ask them, what does localization mean? For them, for some people, they even translated it as tawteen, which means naturalization. They see it as alien, external, there's a conspiracy notion to it. So, and some of them see it as just implementing, flexibility with implementation, but the decision-making is done. So, okay. Now, although if you ever attend the Global Refugee Forum, you will see how, this sector is run. Most refugees can't get a visa to attend the Global Refugee Forum, right? So, but then when you look at funding, actually, the states are not the main funders. This is from an INE report 2020. I thought I added the, you see, they're not the main funders, but the whole machinery, the way it's run, it's still, we inherited the Western global North-centric way of running the system. So why are humanitarian agencies prioritizing the voices of the global North is still a question to be answered, although more and more funding is coming from other agencies, foundations, etc. Okay, we can move to the next slide. I don't know how I'm doing with time. So now we wanted to, this is very quickly, I'm going to share from these studies, which my colleague Sirine Saab will talk more about. But when we looked at research funding, who's producing knowledge? Because I was interested, okay, so why is the agenda going in this direction? Who's dictating this agenda? And when I looked at research funding, this work I've done with Catherine and Sirine, we found most of the research funding is coming from the Global North, and who's holding the funding? Global North institutions and scholars. Okay. And then when we look at, so we analyzed the articles that have been published in the past 20 years, over 800 articles, peer-reviewed in English and Arabic. And we found in Arabic, as I said, 90% were produced on psychology and trauma amongst children, but the majority of the publications were produced by Global North scholars. And 60% of studies on the Global South are produced by Global North. And what is even interesting, co-authorship. We found very little co-authorship. And when co-authorship is happening, it's Global North and Global North. So it's a very extractivist research paradigm. Okay, so Lebanon, very quickly, Lebanon is a very interesting case because there has been a lot of funding and attention and research on Lebanon. So we have a 1 million population of students, and 200 of those children, only 30% of our children go to the public sector. The vast majority of children in Lebanon are educated in the private sector because people have more confidence in the private sector. And when the Syrian conflict started, we have 500,000 children who are school age in Lebanon. Naturally, the community start to respond. They start to provide some form of informal schooling. But then we started to see a shift. And the state of Lebanon wasn't very interested at that time in the response. Like with the Palestinians, they've hardly ever been interested in integrating them. But suddenly this shifted as there have been increasing funding. And then the shift came into let's provide these refugees with an education through the host government, because the system is there, the curriculum is there, the teachers are there, so let's enroll them. Now, obviously, this meant that Lebanon has to triple its capacity in a very short period of time. The plans at that time aimed to enroll 250. So Lebanon had to still multiply its capacity to absorb the children. And these children would learn the Lebanese national curriculum. And in Lebanon, because we are a French colony and we're very proud to be the Swiss of the East, we love foreign languages. So we love to learn in English or French. So you learn math and science in English and French, which is a major issue for our disadvantaged children or non-middle class kids. And now Syrian refugees have also now been seen as inferior because they also don't have a good command of these languages. And the emphasis has been on certified schooling. All right, so 10 years later, okay, we have less than 30% of Syrian refugees enrolled in any form of formal schooling and informal schooling. So we didn't progress much. And one of the main reasons is poverty, but also access and the quality of schooling. Most of these children were educated in afternoon shifts by teachers who are teaching, obviously, either overtime or they're not necessarily trained, and they had to be Lebanese teachers. Syrian teachers were not allowed to teach. Now, less than 1% of those 30% made it to grade 9. So we're talking about the vast majority dropping out before they have any kind of certificate that they can use to go anywhere. During COVID, obviously, Syrian refugees became more vulnerable, and now with the economic crisis, the provisions are really disintegrating. Catherine will be talking about how the humanitarian response actually weakened the state governance during those 10 or 14 years. Rahila. So to conclude, if we want to reflect on those 20 or 25 years of a humanitarian education, my argument is we need to shift the axis of power. So far, we have delocalized the response, shifted into more global north, more bureaucratic humanitarian response, and weakened the sector in Lebanon. If you talk about now Syrian teachers in Lebanon, they haven't been in a class for 14 years. Now they're supposed to go back to Syria. So the de-skilling of these teachers, and we know overall refugees spend 27 years in exile. So if we don't really invest in the whole sector, the whole capacities of everyone within the system, we are only continuing to increase dependency on the humanitarian agencies. And I think to do this, a real partnership between the different actors, whether academics, whether networks, whether local refugee-led organizations is necessary. One last thing. I want to finish with this slide reflecting on the process of doing this research. Because when I was doing this research, the genocide in Gaza started. And one of the things that really is striking about the humanitarian um, academic sector is the utter silence. They didn't organize one talk about the displacement of over 2 million. So how this whole, all these academics who claim to be super liberal, suddenly there is a one line that they can't cross. They can't talk about Palestine or Gaza. And I think that for me, I was really struggling. Okay, how could I say that I'm doing ethical research and I filled the research ethics form, and and when you submit your research for peer review, you have to provide that number. There is a serious issue with how do we do research? What do we consider as ethical research? Is it ethical to go collect data from the field? This is the other language that we use. These are not fields. These are communities. These are societies. We don't just go collect, hit and run data and then we publish without even showing any solidarity when there is a crisis. So I think there is a big issue within this the field of the study of us as scholars that we need to reflect around our research methodologies. Are our research methodologies really ethical, the way we collect them, the way we engage with the communities we work with? Is it really ethical? What is considered as evidence and what is not considered as evidence? We do not value the voices necessarily of teachers or of communities. So I think there is, over those 3 years and with what's happening in Gaza, it's time for us to think as a field of study and a discipline of study how we're doing this research. Thank you very much.